So it seems that we've got some absolutely enormous Warhammer 40k rules and points changes. The balanced data slate for March 2025 is here. Big changes to a whole bunch of factions and units, so let's dive in and see what we've got. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the big new Warhammer 40k update, and it seems that today's the day that Games Workshop is giving us a whole load of new rules content for 40k. This one maybe not quite as crazy big with so many seismic changes as their December update, but still a whole load of really quite interesting stuff, and interestingly a few new detachments, and what almost feels like it's the sort of digital codex release of Chaos Demons pretty much. Lots of changes here, some of them expected, some of them far less so. Games Workshop's announced these changes via a couple of their articles in Warhammer Community, one focusing on the balanced data slate changes and touching on some of their points updates in the Minotaur Field Manual as well, and one of them focusing on the new detachments. It looks like the update's arriving on a Wednesday again, maybe that'll be the day that they usually come out going forward. Previously they seemed to like doing Thursdays, but perhaps we're going to have these a bit more early in the week as a normal now. There's really quite a lot to go through here with a vast amount of documents updated. In general it boils down to a few different areas though. The balanced data slate is one of the main ones. There's no big core sweeping changes to Warhammer 40k here for once. I guess if they do any of those they'll probably do it at the sort of new season one that will happen in summer. But there are still quite a lot of things that affect either certain factions or certain units there. There's also a whole bunch more balance changes hiding in the errata documents for things like the Codex FAQs or Grotmus FAQs. For example, there's a big nerf to the Ork Tactical Brigade there. Then we've got the usual Minotaur Field Manual points updates. Certainly a fair few changes there. It's definitely not one of the bigger changes to the Field Manual though. Mainly a few things being nudged up and down. A couple of struggling factions gaining a bunch of buffs, a couple of stronger ones gaining more nerfs, a few just getting a couple of tiny balance changes. Then as mentioned, it's rather interesting that there's several new detachments here. Orks, Tau, Custodes, and a Bellicor themed detachment. Loads of content to go in there, and apparently this is going to be a common theme with the balance updates going forward now, as well as all the rules drops. There's going to be some genuine new rules content thrown in. Different armies getting their options expanded in a similar sort of way to the Grotmus detachments, and these will be available to use in tournaments and competitive play right from the word go. I really like the theme and flavour of these ones. I think they've done well with them at first impressions. And for this video I thought I'd just go over a couple of the core rules of them in brief, and then talk about them more fully in their own video after. The other really major change that happened was Index Demons being updated in a very big way. Rather unpleasantly, there's been some plastic kits sent to Legends in the Seeker Chariot variants and Karanak. No real reason why they needed to go to Legends given that their plastic miniatures currently on sale. And really not great news for them. I would have certainly expected the Finecast datasheets to have got phased out before they did. Otherwise though, as well as their new detachment with Bellicor, they've also got a whole bunch of updates to a massive amount of units as well. This basically feels like what the Codex release for 10th edition would be if they were going to get one, which still seems unlikely. I'd guess that these datasheets are going to match the updated ones that they're going to get in the Deity Legion codexes. We've had Emperor's Children revealed, and Death Guard, World Eaters, and Thousand Suns are on the way. It does seem as well that those text leaks that I talked about in a previous video have turned out to be broadly correct. I was a bit skeptical of them at the time, just due to the new detachments being mentioned. Admittedly, they did describe the detachments very, very badly, saying the Tau one was suit focused when it's more weapon focused, and the Custodes one is more character focused when it's more infantry focused really. They were some of the things that felt the most unlikely, but it does seem that Games Workshop is dropping new detachments for armies all the time now. Loads to jump into, so let's go through and talk about all the changes. First up, for Codex Space Marines, we do have the change that most people were expecting. The boosted Oath of Moment is now only locked to core Codex Space Marine detachments, so you can't say take Blood Angels, Liberator Assault Group, or Angelic Inheritors or something, and then get the +1 to wound from Oath of Moment if you don't take any Blood Angels actual datasheets. This one seemed like it was obviously going to happen. Games Workshop generally want these divergent chapters to play their fun unique units, and this definitely felt like a rules oversight as opposed to anything that was intended by Games Workshop trying to create a sort of middle class of sort of divergent but not Space Marine chapters. No big surprises there. Bloodless Angels and Friends have gone away as list archetypes, and they clarify what counts as a core Codex Space Marines detachment in an FAQ. It's basically the ones that are printed in the Codex plus the Librarius one, as you'd guess. I don't think too many people will be shedding tears after that. It was more of a gameplay quirk than anything that people were massively enjoying. Otherwise, for Codex Space Marines, Ultramarines in particular were doing rather well at tournaments, taking home lots of top spots, and it does seem that as a result it's mainly nerfs for the Space Marines more so than buffs. For the points, people were spamming Vindicators and Ballistus Dreadnoughts in a big way. Both of those have gone up 10 points, but remain perfectly usable datasheets, just not quite a standout versus the competition anymore. Whirlwinds take another hit, up to 190. They've been embraced by a few lists with the new +1 to wound Oath of Moment, and Games Workshop really does like to keep artillery pretty niche. The Predator Destructor and Predator Annihilator both went up. That seems to have been the case for just about every army, and they're all sort of the same at 140 or 135 now, no matter whether they're in Codex Space Marines or various Chaos Space Marine legions out there. Again, not great news for the Destructor, given that that was a fairly strong datasheet. It might make people look more at Gladiator Lancers again, with so much of the competition getting nerfed perhaps. The Company Heroes went up to 105 points, which was maybe a shame. They were being quite popular for certain characters, such as maybe Calgar or Uriel Ventris. Still usable, but again, might have some draw to looking at, say, things like cheap Assault Intercessors with their wound rerolls perhaps. Marnie's Calgar himself goes up to 210 points from 200. Fairly expected there maybe, given that lots of Ultramarines lists were taking him in addition to Rabute Gilliman. And the Librarius Fusillade enhancement goes up to 35 points from 15. That's the one that can make a ridiculously dangerous Stern Guard unit that can basically one-shot near anything in the game. Paying 35 points doesn't seem unreasonable for that one, really. Despite so much focus and attention with doubling up on Oath of Moment and the extra stratagems, Rabute Gilliman himself looks like he escaped unharmed. 4 points buffs though, it looks like Blade Guard Veterans dropped down to 80 points from 90. I feel like that's a really nice boost for them. They've generally been feeling a bit on the undertuned side since 10th edition came out. Might have them a little bit more tempting as maybe a retinue for your characters as aside from Company Heroes or Assault Intercessors now. Centurion Devastators went down to 165 points per 3, so really quite good damage stats for the cost there. But as we'll get on to, they did restrict their shenanigans with a Mr. Uriel Ventris, and then the Gladius Fire Discipline enhancement dropped down to 25 points from 40. Good to see that change happen really, given that that one was costed that much just due to the fact that it had that big lethal hit sustained hits combo going on that got broken. Overall, definitely some nerfs for the most meta Space Marine builds there. Maybe not the worst thing to rebalance the armour a little bit, given that Ballistus Dreadnoughts and Vindicators did seem to be rather dominant over the other options. Though I feel like most of these nerfs aren't really to the sort of tune where they're massively going to affect the strength of the faction. I feel like Blade Guard Veterans look genuinely interesting now, and Centurion Devastators still look good, even if their best combo's been nerfed. Speaking of which, there were just a few rules changes for Space Marines. Uriel Ventris Deep Strike ability now only works on Phobos Gravis or Tacticus keyword units. Previously it was just Astartes infantry, and the done thing was to give it to Devastator Centurions and have them repeatedly warping around the board in Vanguard Spearhead with return to reserve, and just unleash their massive firepower on whatever they wanted. It did feel a bit weird with Sneaky Centurions in the sort of Phobos and Raven Guard themed attachment, and that's definitely a blow to Vanguard Spearhead in general, though I guess there's still other units that like it quite a lot, maybe Hellblasters or Eradicators. The Devastator Centurions still could be used in Vanguard Spearhead as well, they just have to reappear at the board edges to get line of sight from there as opposed to literally anywhere. It would limit their targets, but it should still mean that they very reliably get lines of sight on things that matter. Given a 20-point drop, I still think that they're potentially interesting. Otherwise, there were a few more small changes. The Stormlance reactive move stratagem for 6 inches now only works on infantry and mounted, so you can't reactive move, say, 6 inches with a big scary tank or dreadnought anymore. I'm not sure if that was getting abused in some major way, but it's still a very powerful stratagem, just limited to certain units now. The Phobos Lieutenant has had a combo broken with Reavers, where you could deep strike, move shoot move d6 inches and still charge. Now the move shoot move has been boosted to a big 6 inches, but you can no longer charge after that, and that just works the same as a lot more other units out there in Warhammer 40k. He was kind of the exception to be able to move shoot move and still be able to charge really. That maybe felt like an oversight from the early part of 10th edition. I feel like it wasn't a combo that was exactly broken though, and was kind of interesting with Reavers. I'm not really sure that it needed changing all that much. Finally, the Gravis Captain got a couple of keywords on his mastercrafted heavy bolt rifle with the assault and heavy one. Overall, it's certainly more nerfs than buffs for core Codex Space Marines. I suspect that these changes will have kind of minimal effect on a fair few people's armies out there, depending on exactly what they're running. Ballistus Dreadnoughts and Vindicators will definitely hit the most meta lists, as will Marnie's Calgar with Company Heroes for Ultramarine players. Still looks like Ultramarines are going to be on top with Rabute Gilliman in Pride of Place though. Otherwise, for Imperial factions, the Adepta Sororitas were an army that a lot of people had a lot of hopes pinned on this one for. Arguably the weakest mainline faction of Warhammer 40k, with win rates around about 42% or less, just due to a rather horrible combination of having far too many nerfs, both with a big battery of points increases and then a whole bunch of rules nerfs after that, including to their Miracle Dice mechanic. They haven't just done reversals of these nerfs, unfortunately. The Miracle Dice one has only been improved slightly. It's still only 1 per battle round, not 1 per game turn like it was before, though you do now get 1 every single time a Sister of Battle unit is lost, rather than just a maximum of 1 destroyed per phase. If, say, you lost 3 Sisters units in the shooting phase, it feels like a step in the right direction, though I feel like they could have just reversed it back to the previous mechanic. To me, that still doesn't feel like quite enough. Otherwise, they got some points reductions. Seraphim and Zephyrim dropped down to 85 points per 5. Seraphim no longer have the increased cost for the bigger unit. I guess now Bringers of Flame got nerfed so much. Repentia dropped 5 to 85 points per 5 of them. Arco-Flagellants are now 140 per 10. Dominions are down to 115 from 125, and Celestian Sacrosancts get one of the biggest points cuts. A big 10-strong unit of them drops down to 130 points from 150. I think all those are genuinely good points cuts to units that weren't all that far from being quite viable. I think the Dominions will make sense in the context of the Bringers of Flame nerfs, as do the Seraphim going back down again. Arco-Flagellants and Repentia both look good options for charging out of rhinos or out of line of sight and destroying stuff. I feel like Celestian Sacrosancts at 13 points per model is definitely going to make people take a second look at them though. Kind of weird that the bigger squad is cheaper, given that that's the way that you probably want to take them anyway. And their essential unit in the Grotmas detachment, the Champions of Faith, they're still not going to have a very big Miracle Dice supply to make that work. Otherwise, the other nerfs remain in place. Things to Bringers of Flame and the Triumph of St. Catherine, which still has its stupid 250 point cost. That really is one that they should bring the points cost down if they're not going to give it the big boosted Miracle Dice ability. Overall, for first impressions, it feels like a step in the right direction. I feel like Sisters will be more in line with the lower tier factions of Warhammer 40k, though I'd be kind of surprised if this gets them to a particularly good place. Next up, for the Astra Militarum, we've got some big nerfs to the Bridgehead Strike. It looks like both Guard and Aeldari, who have had their codexes go tournament live recently, both copped nerfs. The Guard Bridgehead Strike still seemed to be the one that most people were going for on the tournament scene, the one that boosts Scions with a bunch of extra damage and some interesting redeployment tricks. As was stated in the prior leak, it looks like the core rule for the Bridgehead Strike was changed so that the Tempestus bit is the one that gets +1 to hit when they're set up on the board rather than +1 to wound, which certainly is a much weaker buff. They do get some wound rerolls now if they can target things in certain places on objectives, but they still wanted that +1 to wound rolls for allowing special weapons to punch up against really tough stuff efficiently. It also doesn't work great with orders either, given that you could already have Tempestus hit on a 2+ with take aim, so a +1 to hit isn't really all that useful for them, though I guess it does let you use things like either take cover or first rank fire as a bonus order, I suppose. Overall, it is a big nerf. The detachment still gives you the reroll ones to hit with infantry though, and that's not gone away. For some reason, people seem to really misunderstand the detachment changes when I talked about the potential in the leaks video, and otherwise it looks like they've changed the hotshot lasgun stratagem to be 2 command points and only working against things within 12 inches, still adding +1 strength and +1 AP to hotshot weapons. Not sure why they've been quite so harsh to that one. I feel like hotshot weapons wouldn't have quite as much bite if they don't have easy access to +1 to wound, but looks like that one will be very rarely used now, if ever. Otherwise, for that detachment, the Bombast Vox Array also went up to 35 points. That's the one that allowed you to treble up on orders. Doesn't seem to make all that much sense now, and both Tempestus Scions went up to 70 points per 5, and then Tempestus Command Squads went up to 85. They were 75 points before, so it really looks like Bridgehead has been nuked from all sides. The best units for the detachment going up, and the core rule getting far weaker. As a result, I'd be kind of surprised if people build around that as the strongest guard detachment now. It does perhaps kind of feel that if you make the core detachment changes, you might not need to increase the points cost on the Scion things, but Games Workshop don't like to do things by halves. Otherwise, there were a few more follow-up guard nerfs. Indirect fire got hit once again. Cadian and Catachan heavy weapon squads went up to 65 points from 50. I suspect that would be to address mortars. They were being used with Creed as some at least fairly good anti-infantry firepower, shooting from out of line of sight. The field ordnance batteries went up to 110, as some of the other most efficient artillery in the codex. Seems that siege batteries were untouched though. It maybe feels a little bit on the nose that the artillery teams are now the best indirect firepower, or I'd guess so after the field ordnance increase. Finally, there was also a nerf to the Combat Engineer remote mine. Previously, you could use it within 12 inches on units that weren't visible to it. Now you have to be within 9 inches and it's units that are visible, and it's only now D3 wounds if it hits something non-vehicle related, or 2D3 if it hits a vehicle or fortification. That's a pretty big nerf to the Krieg Combat Engineers, so I guess it's not every new unit that gets positive attention. Overall, definitely a good bunch of nerfs for the Guard, unfortunately. Seems that this will have a bit more focus on the actual Codex detachments. A fair few people were running Combined or Hammer of the Emperor. They were the next most popular one ones aside from the bridgehead in the first week or so of tournament results. For the most part, it looks like this one only really hits artillery and scion things, so big scary tanks and Kazakin squads and Tauroxes are still very much go. Before we move on, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titans Terrain. One option to get a table full of Warhammer 40k terrain on the go very quickly, their option being quite a different one to most out there, the idea being that the entire battlefield is made of sort of pop-up cardboard terrain. You have a grid system of 12 tiles that makes a 45 inches by 60 inch game board, the right size for 2000 point 40k, and then each tile unfolds and pops a building, so you can basically have an entire battlefield worth of terrain that can fold flat and fit in a box set around about the same size as a standard board game. There's definitely some trade-offs to having folding cardboard terrain, like it not having the texture of say plastic sets out there, but it does have the rather big advantages of not needing any hobby work to actually be able to use it straight away, and being particularly easy to store and very portable, so if you wanted to take it round to a friend's house or something, or have it pack away in a very small space if you don't have much room, that might be a good option compared with some of the rest out there. In any case, I'll leave their stuff linked down in the video description if you want to check them out, and talk through the range briefly at the end of the video for those interested. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, we're on to the Golden Boys of the Adeptus Custodes, and they've got a rather surprising amount of changes, if anything. I felt like there was always going to be a good chance of some nerfs to Solar Spearhead, given that that detachment was doing quite so well in tournaments and things, and it looks like that has happened, with the Telemon Dreadnought going up to 225 points from 215, the Venerable Contemptor going up to 170 from 160, and they were the two dreadnoughts that tended to be spammed the most. The Augury uplink for the 5+ Feel No Pain that seemed auto-include on a Telemon, that's also gone up to 35 points, so it's certainly less standout than it was before, though still gives you an incredibly chunky dreadnought. Weirdly enough though, it does look like Solar Spearhead actually got a small buff, with their walk through wall stratagem no longer just applying in the movement phase, but can also apply in the charge phase as well, so you can have dreadnoughts charge through walls if it makes sense to. Overall some small nerfs there, but not unsurmountable. Otherwise though, it looks like Games Workshop's decided to try and right the balance a bit between the Blade Champions and Wardens versus Custodian Guard and Shield Captains. It basically just seemed that by the numbers, the Wardens were the way to go in terms of a strong battle line for Custodes, perhaps Custodian Guard only really getting a look in with Inquisitor Draxus. In this update, it looks like the Custodian Guard have dropped down 10 points to 170 for 4 or 215 for 5. The Wardens have gone up 10 points accordingly, so they're 210 or 260, so quite significantly more than the Guard now. The Blade Champion goes up 10 points, and the Shield Captains of all varieties go down 10. And now it looks like there's a lot more choice between the two units rather than just all one or the other. It also drops the points cost on Alea and the Knight Centura. I guess that could be at least somewhat interesting for Talons of the Emperor or for the Nor Maidens. Overall, definitely some big nerfs to their best build now. You can put a lot of Custodians on the table though if you just went for Custodian Guard spam, and nice to see the Shield Captains having a little bit more draw to them. I wouldn't be too surprised that, as per Solar Spearhead and the current attachments of Custodians were maybe a bit weaker overall, but probably not by too much. On the other hand though, they have thrown a new detachment into the mix, which is the Lions of the Emperor. The core rule is a pretty huge damage buff of +1 to hit and wound when you're not within 6 inches of a friendly model for non-vehicles. I guess the +1 to hit won't often be having too much effect, other than countering things like enemy stealth or something. That'll incentivize some big scary infantry units and biker units fighting independently of each other. The +1 to wound on Guardian Spear style profiles on top of Martial Qatar is pretty brutal. They've got a bunch of interesting support as well, which I'll talk through in the next video. I did quite like to see the return of the Unleash the Lion stratagem though, splitting a Terminator squad into a bunch of different units of one. Could be annoying to deal with, though I guess that would probably get in the way of you using your core rule. Will be interesting to see what Custodes players make of that. The +1 to wound buff on Guardian Spears is definitely very, very scary though. Next up, not so much for the Admech. I feel like the army isn't in a terrible place, though still isn't being treated with the most excitement from Admech players. It is definitely a fair bit better than Codex launch though. It had some minimal changes here. Belisarius Cole dropping down to 135 from 150. I feel like at that cost he's a lot more of a feels good choice as opposed to the 150. I think he was a bit borderline then really, even if he is kind of tanky. And the Tech Priest Dominus also takes a small points cut, dropping down to 65. He can be fairly nice with breaches and things for his 5+ Feel No Pain. Nothing crazy happening there, and most of their units are fairly viable. A lot of people making good use of the Halo Screed detachment that better supports the whole army than some of them. For the Grey Knights, their points change was Interceptors getting a bit cheaper by 5 points, they're down to 125 points per 5, and that seems like a nice enough change for them. They were already pretty viable at 130, I thought, given the big boosted movement. Perhaps more relevant to their top list, though, are Purgation Squads with their indirect fire being nerfed in the Warpbane task force. The Warpbane one is the one that gives you 4 rerolls to hit if you're standing in your hallowed ground. That's really good for things like Dread Knight shooting and just Grey Knight damage output in general, but Purgation Squads with Psy Cannons were being used for a bit of indirect fire with that, the rerolls to hit being particularly good with that indirect rule. It looks like they're no longer able to do that though. If you want to use those rerolls, then it has to be a unit that's actually visible to you. So it doesn't work with the Purgation Squad indirect fire anymore. I guess that could also have some weird effects for things like, say, fighting through ruined walls when you can't see your target. I guess occasionally you might be in the situation where you can fight an enemy unit but you can't actually see them, and again that could be one way to stop the rerolls happening. Maybe not the craziest change in the world there. Not the best feels for the Purgation Squad though, that's maybe a bit on the niche side anyway. I guess Grey Knights probably aren't too far off getting their codex. We had them teased and it looks like they could be around about summertime, hopefully adding a few more interesting ways to play the army. For the Imperial Knights, their last update saw them get some very cheap armigers with 130 point Helverins and 140 point Warglaves. They've generally had a fairly good time since, with win rates in the sort of low to mid 50s sort of range and a few big tournament successes. Looks like they will be keeping their super cheap armigers, and I'm sure that a lot of lists will still be using lots and lots of those. The only major change that they got this time around were the Castellan and Valiant dropping down to 480 points, so quite a big boost for the Dominus Knights there. I still feel like out of the two, the Valiant should probably cost less than the Castellan, given that it doesn't access Overwatch anymore. Both of them definitely got more viable if you want to put them on the tabletop though, and the Castellan I thought was pretty good as a data sheet to start with, particularly in a fairly vehicle-heavy meta. At just 480 points it feels like really quite a strong big knight choice now. Again, like the Grey Knights, were probably not too far off their codex. I guess probably summertime as well, maybe alongside those Chaos Knights. We'll wait and see there. Seems like they're probably going to be doing pretty well on the win rate up until that point though. For the Imperial Agents, unfortunately Games Workshop still don't seem to be putting in any effort to actually make them work as a proper standalone army. I think at this point, barring any surprises, it doesn't look like they're going to. More just having them as a sort of themed allied force that you can play if you like, but isn't really supposed to be very tournament competitive outside of a few people doing weird board control things with Imperialist fleets. Some people do seem to have been having some competitive success with that, but it's not really the way that most people play Warhammer 40k, so isn't exactly great for the majority of people out there. Otherwise, they just got the 1 points buff, Collectus Assassins dropping down to 85 points from 100. I guess that's in context of them not getting a 3-inch deep strike anymore, they get a 6-inch one instead, and that points cut applies both to core agents and allies. I feel like before compared with the 100 point one with a 3-inch deep strike, that actually might make them better if anything. Lone operatives are pretty nice to have if they're cheap enough. You can still drop into places that you otherwise wouldn't be able to, will be good against certain armies with the psychic thing, and might be able to battle shock some armies off objectives. That rule works out to 9 inches, so you could still put it down on certain units maybe holding a home field objective and deny some victory points. Might be a more tempting choice for some of them, though I still expect most armies to be looking at the Calidus first for jumping around doing victory point things. Lastly, for the Imperium, we've got the bunch of Divergent chapters. For the Blood Angels, they've generally been doing fairly well, though as mentioned a fair few of them using their sort of Bloodless Angels, using no unique units but their Liberator or Angelic Inheritors and getting +1 to wound over moment. As mentioned, that's no longer possible. They did get some nice points cuts to Death Company though. The Death Company Marines and their variant datasheet with the Bolt Rifles went down to 85 points, or to 160 points if you take a big unit of 10 of them. They still generally want a chaplain in the units to actually give them some OC, but for the stats that you get for the points, they are really quite impressive at the moment. They get the Eviscerators and a Power Fist in there. They certainly pack a punch in melee, and are tougher than the average Space Marine, being only 16 points with a 6+ Feel No Pain built in. Maybe that will now be enough to have a few more people look at them if you want a foot melee squad. The Death Company Jump Captain got cheaper as well, though I still don't see really why you'd take him versus Chaplains. He's competing both against the regular Jump Chaplain and also the named ones. And otherwise the Rage Fueled Warrior enhancement for the Liberator Assault group got even more expensive, now a massive 35 points if you want that single phase worth of sustained hits 3. Basically only viable if you're taking it with the Space Marine Captain and doubling up with his big turn of extra attacks and big damage boosts. Still means that captain will be able to kill most things in the game in a single round of combat, but now you're paying a lot of points for the privilege, particularly if you're backing him up with some assault intercessors or similar. Overall, maybe not the worst set of changes though. Quite nice to see the Death Company Space Marines get a bit more viable on foot. Dark Angels next, and it looks like this one's a quiet update for them. No direct changes to them, though they did have quite a lot of Raven Wing focused things on the last update. Rules changes to things like Black Knight, Samael, the Company of Hunters and more. I guess they will be affected by a bunch of the Space Marine support changes, with things like Vindicators and Ballistus Dreadnoughts going up slightly. I feel like the main downside for Dark Angels, though, is not to get some sort of help for their struggling detachments. They're still the only one of the Divergent chapters that generally tends to play with core Codex detachments in competitive play as opposed to their own unique ones, which still feels like a balance failing on Games Workshop's part. It seems like most people are either using Stormlance or Gladius Task Force now. Space Wolves similarly have no points or rules changes. It seems that Games Workshop's been hinting towards a big release for them sometime later in the edition. As with the rest, they can't use Boosted Oath with their Champions of Rust attachment or anything like that, and they were hit by some of the Space Marine nerfs, such as the firepower small points increases. I guess maybe they could have some good use for Blade Guard veterans though. They could be an interesting datasheet for the Space Wolves in their detachment and melee stuff. The same is true for the Black Templars. I feel like they could have done with a bit of help really, given that they were towards the lower end of the Warhammer 40k meta. Maybe people feeling just a bit down on them, given Games Workshop's increased a bunch of the datasheets where they're just kind of interesting but nothing feeling amazingly stand out. Again, just core Codex Space Marine changes for them and the Boosted Oath thing being more limited. And then for Deathwatch, finally, there were a couple of changes. The Deathwatch Terminator squad got a small points increase for their 5-man squad with 3 Cyclone missile launchers. That goes up to 190. Still a very nice price for a Terminator unit with that kind of firepower in my opinion. And it was also paired with the large squad going down to 350 points, given that you get the heavy weapons in the first squad. In general though, I don't really see why you'd take anything other than 5 of them. Otherwise, their other scary kill team units escaped any changes, which is maybe kind of fortunate for them. They were on the upper end of the Warhammer 40k power spectrum, and certainly looks like they'll be continuing to be. Otherwise, they had a small FAQ to state that if you use adaptive tactics, then it can be used to give Space Marine units mission tactics. They previously clarified that the Black Spear mission tactics detachment rule only applies to things that lists it on their datasheet, working kind of differently to just about all the detachment rules out there in Warhammer 40k. So that means that you don't get the lethal hits or sustained hit things on generic Space Marine datasheets. You can use this to, say, flex them into lethal hits or sustained hits when it matters though. In general though, not really too many changes for the Deathwatch. Looks like they're still going to be a pretty powerful army. Getting into the Legions of Chaos next, and for Core Codex Chaos Marines, again it wasn't the biggest rules update in the world. The December one was also kind of limited. The biggest thing there perhaps being the Creations of Bile, which is still one of their more popular and successful detachments with its big focus on marine melee. It did get a couple of nice points decreases though, the Lord Discordant dropping down from 175 to 160. I still think that the datasheet isn't worth that, but it gets kind of helpful to see it moving in the right general direction. The Forge Fiend drops down to 180, which I think will have it a bit more in contention with the other firepower units. It maybe wasn't quite so common as it had been in the past. The Predator Annihilator gets the points increased to 135. As mentioned, it seems like all the Predators are going to 140 for the Destructor and 135 for the Annihilator. I suppose it did get a tiny rules boost last time, being able to reroll all damage rolls. In general though, seems like it's business as usual for the Chaos Marines. I don't imagine lists will change too much like this. I guess the Forge Fiend boost is the most important thing. Feels like that could be alright for Soul Forged Warpack or maybe Pack Bound. For the Death Guard, they were also on the upper end of the 40k power spectrum. Lots of Death Shroud Terminators, Mortarion, Typhus, some Plague Marines and Rhinos, plus some Demon Engine or Predator firepower. They have had the same nerfs to the Predator tank chassis though. The Predator Destructor going up to 140 points in particular I think will be kind of painful for the Death Guard. They often tended to be a staple firepower unit in a lot of armies. The Predator changes have gone hand in hand by the Mephitic Blight Haulers dropping down by 5 points though. They're only 85 points each now, and they were already being running competitive lists from time to time. I feel like they're looking really quite a fun, efficient little demon firepower engine now. These guys and the other Deity Legion Chaos Codexes will be the next ones to have their codexes out, so it seems that these rules and points changes won't last all that much longer before things are heavily rewritten, with presumably putting the demons in the book and getting a bunch more detachments to play with. For the Thousand Suns, they don't seem to have been played quite so much in recent times, though the people who have been playing with them seem to have been doing at least okay. It looks like they've got the tank cost standardised, with the Predators going up and the Vindicator going to match at 185. Seems maybe a little bit pointless just doing it to neatly match the things in other codexes, given that they weren't exactly played very much here. Perhaps the more meaningful points nerf is the Mutalith Vortex Beast, going up very slightly to 165 points, though that's not exactly going to be a change that makes the difference between it being good or bad. Perhaps the most interesting points change were to Scarab Occult Terminators. They've dropped down to 180 points per 5 of them from 190, and the Terminator Sorcerer also drops to 105. I guess that's a 30-point discount on a big 10-man Terminator squad with a Sorcerer attached if you wanted to go that far. It's still a very big points investment though. Feels like at this point they're probably getting to the point where they compete a fair bit better. Games Workshop does just seem to have been inching down their points cost update after update. Though I feel like perhaps it's going to be more interesting when they get their codex. I'm sure there'll be some synergies that work better on Scarab Occult than anything else. Otherwise, the Games Workshop seem to have embraced their big unit versus small unit disparity here more than most. So big units of cultists drop down to 100 points from 110. Big units of Zangors are now just 120 for 20 Goat Birdmen, and 6 Enlightened are down to 80, though the small unit cost for all of those stays the same. I feel like they're interesting enough changes. I guess 120 points for 20 OC2 models that get a 5+ invulnerable save could be at least interesting enough on the Zangor front. Most of these units of chaff just make a lot more sense to be fielded in small units rather than big ones though. I'm not sure a 10-point discount is going to be quite enough. Next for the Deity Legions, we've got the World Eaters. They actually got some fairly meaningful changes in their HQ section. The Demon Princes both went down 15 points apiece. The Winged one now 185 points and the Foot one 155. That seems like a very good change to me, as both of those were generally considered rather overcosted. Feels like both of those are a lot more viable if you do want to put them on the table. I'm not sure if that'll make them downright common though. The bigger relative drop though was to the Juggernaut Lord, which is now only 80 points. If you just want some guy to bear an enhancement, then this guy's very easy to do so now. I feel like he might still just get run all by himself as opposed to leading units though. Just at 80 points for a cheapish and toughish and fairly fighty unit that can bear enhancements. It seems like he could be a fairly interesting little nuisance unit, and maybe could even be a rival for Spawn there. Otherwise the Predator tanks also increased to 135 and 140 just like the rest. They didn't tend to be the things that people tended to use all that much for fire support though. With those increases, it also makes things like War Dog Brigands seem better. As with the rest, not too long till their codex comes out, so these changes will be fairly short-lived before things change in a really big way anyway. Lastly, for the Deity Legions, we've got the Emperor's Children. Their big thing was just having their points cost revealed. I did suspect that they might well be coming out in this update. Unlike the Astra Militarum ones that we had before, these are sort of the interim points costs, aimed to be used to make the codex playable right from the word go, but not really tournament legal, so in general you can't play Emperor's Children at tournaments until their actual full army release. You can't even buy their unique miniatures separately at the moment, unless you got a few of them in the launch box set. As best I can tell, it looks like these points costs are the exact same ones as were given out to the Games Workshop approved content creators. They're quite different to the codex points cost in a number of different places. The troops data sheets are both looking rather excellent at just 85 points each. I feel like both of those will be borderline auto-includes in a bunch of armies. Particularly the Lord Exultant with Infractors looks very, very scary. And alongside this, they still have a tiny index section that just has the points cost for Lucius the Eternal and Noise Marines with their index Emperor's Children that you can field alongside Codex Chaos Space Marines. Overall, it's going to be cool to see what people build with these and what does well when the Emperor's Children hit the tournament scene in earnest, though that might not be for a little while yet until the actual codex comes out and their kits get released. For the Chaos Knights, the changes weren't huge here, though at least for once it seems that they actually tried to narrow the gap a tiny bit between the Titanic Knights and the War Dogs. Another nudge for the Titanic Knights in the right direction, the Desecrator dropping down to 400 points, the Despoiler to 400 as well. That's a 10 and 15 point reduction there, and the Knight Tyrant matching the Castellans for the Imperium, going down to 480, though in general aren't quite as good as the Castellans for the Imperium as they don't get the massive inbuilt rerolls and feel no pain. Despite having the biggest drop, I still don't think that the Tyrant is particularly standout, unfortunately. Both the Desecrator and Despoiler look interesting enough though. You can do double Gatling cannon things, and the Desecrator has a fair amount of anti-tank shooting. Quite a few Chaos Knight lists have been going fairly big War Dog spam, maybe with one Titanic Knight. There's still plenty of armies that go completely without and then just use some allied demons. I can't really see that changing enormously with this, just given that the points decreases aren't huge again. 10 or 15 points isn't massive on a 400 point unit, but again, nice to see at least the gap being narrowed somewhat. And if you did want to put a Desecrator or Despoiler on the table, it's not going to be such a bad idea to do so. Again, Codex probably coming soon for these guys, probably in summer or thereabouts. I'm sure that will have a far bigger impact as to the army's play than tiny points nudges like these. Finally, for the ranks of Chaos, the single biggest changes it seemed came to the Chaos Demons, which both kind of needed some balance redresses due to being one of the strongest armies in the game at the moment. They had win rates of 56%, largely driven by the sheer power of Legion of Excess for the Slaanesh Demons, but as mentioned, it also seems that this is sort of the nearest thing that Chaos Demons will get to a Codex in 10th edition, given that we're seeing a whole bunch of datasheet changes for them, and these look like the sort of datasheet changes that will probably be matching the ones that they come out in the Deity Codexes with. We've seen the ones for the Slaanesh Demons for the Emperor's Children, and then we'll get the equivalent ones for Khorne, Nurgle and Tzeentch. For the points changes, these do often come in context of new datasheet rules. Be'lakor's gone up to 375, but he got some interesting ability changes. The epitome for Slaanesh is 125, the mask is 95, both up a bit. Flesh Hounds are now 75.5, but they do have a return to reserves rule. The Great Unclean one did get a nerf, going up to 250 at base, and then the big Feel No Pain of the Endless Gift enhancement finally got an increase to 45. I feel like that one was that was kind of surprising how long it stuck around at its current very cheap points cost, and Fiends went to 110 points per 3. Otherwise, there were a fair few drops as well. Flamers of Tzeentch dropping down to 65 from 75, and they were already pretty solid before. Screamers went down to 80 and they were 85. Shalaxi Hellbane went down to 380, though did get big datasheet nerfs with the Slaanesh changes. And Nurglings dropped a little bit, though their Mischief Maker special rule isn't as good as it used to be, only debuffing things in engagement range. For the datasheet changes, there's so much here that I'm going to talk about it in a separate video. It basically almost feels like a Codex launch for Chaos Demons near enough. The Slaanesh ones basically had copy-pasted changes from the Emperor's Children, though did have a few differences. For example, Shalaxi Hellbane's special rules were changed, now having to pick a quarry at the start of the game, and having a weapon that's not quite as dangerous as it used to be. And the Shining Aegis got worse as well, only being a 3+ save for the demons now, and not a 5+ Feel No Pain. Fiends now trigger Desperate Escape rules as their main datasheet rule, but only for things in engagement range with them. Demonettes gained Fight first, as did a few other things, but now have a Battle Shock roll instead of their rerolls. Otherwise, as mentioned, there's a ton more changes, too many to discuss here really. Bloodletters move 8 inches, Flesh Hounds can return to reserves, Beast of Nurgle can scout, Great Unclean Ones have a +1 toughness aura, Blood Crushers gaining a 3+ save, and Scarbrand can advance and charge. Lots of stuff to dig into, some of the changes for the better, some of them maybe for the worse. Otherwise though, we basically knew that the Legion of Excess was going to get toned down. This was the single most overperforming detachment in Warhammer 40k with sort of crazy 66 or more % win rates. Previously, this would give you the ability to trade fights first when you charge something for full rerolls to hit and wound, which often wasn't the biggest trade-off in the world if you'd charged something that wasn't particularly great in melee. Now it's still a big damage boost, but far less so. You now get reroll 1s to hit and wounds like the leak suggests, being buffed to rerolling all hit rolls and 1s to wound in the Shadow of Chaos. That's definitely going to put a huge dent in the damage output that they have, though still bear in mind it's still a good damage buff. Just reroll 1s to hit and wound alone is still plus 36% on the expected damage that you'd get otherwise, and if you had a unit that was hitting on a 3+ like Fiends for example, and they were in your Shadow of Chaos, that's still a plus 56% damage output boost, but it does mean that they're not really quite as general purpose with a sort of mid-strength and devastating wounds. 4 wound rerolls on that just made them pretty great against literally everything. Otherwise, they had some stratagem changes as well. Thieves of Pain was the bouncing damage stratagem. Basically, when you needed a unit to live, you could bounce some damage to a different one. That's limited in a few more ways. You can now only be within 9 inches, not 12. The units must be visible to each other rather than bouncing to something out of line of sight, and it doesn't work on vehicles anymore, so no using it on soul grinders. It's still an interesting option, though definitely far more limited, and using it to help out soul grinders surviving isn't going to be a thing. Finally, Overwhelming Excess no longer has its seriously powerful turn-off shooting thing. Now it's just a -1 to hit, either in the shooting phase or fight phase, which is still handy enough to have. Previously it was just in shooting as well, so now you can use it as a melee damage debuff. That actually could be genuinely useful if your opponent's going to be fighting first a lot of the time. But now it no longer has the Battle Shock chance to prevent enemy shooting. Not exactly the end of the world, and that was kind of unreliable anyway, but certainly just gave you a small chance to utterly mess with the enemy firepower, but a bit more of a rough with a smooth with that particular change. Overall, between that and a few changes to the Slaanesh Demon datasheets, it certainly does feel like a big nerf to the detachment. At first impressions, I'd still guess that it'd be pretty playable, just probably far less standout so, and certainly not at the 65% plus win rate thing, stomping the rest of Warhammer 40k. One of the slightly more unfortunate surprises of the balance update were that a couple of demon units have gone to Legends. The Seeker Chariot variants and Karanak have both been cut. As best I can tell, there's no real reason for this one really. Karanak's got a pretty recent plastic model, and the Seeker Chariots are plastic Slanesh models. It's not a phase out of Finecast or anything, maybe just being more limited to the Sigmar setting perhaps, and just seem to reduce the options in the Demons Index. I suspect that there will be more cuts in the not too distant future as well. They've got a bunch of Finecast models that don't have miniatures on sale, like the Blue Scribes and Epidemius and friends. I'd be very surprised if they stick around for much longer. I think Karanak's a bit of a sad one really, being a fun three-headed dog. I don't imagine that too many people went so heavy on the Seeker Chariots, though they were a datasheet that you could have spammed quite a lot. I'm sure there's a couple of people out there that had a vast amount of them, and that could be incredibly painful if so. Finally for the Demons, they were one of the armies that got a bonus detachment in the Shadow Legion. This one's another Chaos Undivided one, and this one being a Be'lakor themed one. Really quite a fun one with a whole bunch of different options, different buffs for each one of the Chaos deities, which seem to make sense for the units that they're supporting. And on top of that, you get far more datasheet access, as you can ally half your army as Chaos Space Marine datasheets from a set list. This one genuinely looks like a pretty interesting detachment on first impressions. I'm sure there'll be some people who are very keen to try it. They've got some buffs like the Slaneshi units preventing Overwatch, which is quite big for fragile profiles like them. Tzeentch units are all -1 to hit, Khorne units can advance and charge, and Nurgle units get a -1 to wound against big strong attacks. Be'lakor even gets access to Dark Pacts for some sustained or lethal hits as well. And Heretic Astartes get the Deep Strike ability. Lots of interesting stuff even before getting onto the stratagems, and I feel like this one will probably be a popular detachment going forward. Next up we've got the Aeldari, and it looks like there's some rules nerfs to a bunch of different things. It's a codex that we haven't really had all that much tournament data for yet, but it does look like they're one of the stronger factions in Warhammer 40k after a few weeks worth of play. Lots of lists using either Aspect Host or War Host, and Devoted of Iniad are doing rather well as well. The points nerfs they got focus on their more played Aspect Warriors. Dark Reaper big units went up, going up to 195 from 180. They were perhaps one of the biggest, scariest and most efficient units to use stratagems on, like jumping in and out of Wave Serpents. Fire Dragons went up 10 points per 5 of them to 110. I feel like for their sheer destructive damage output, they'll still be an absolutely fine unit, but will be less standout like that, and they're still very fragile of course. Striking Scorpions are now 85 points per small unit, so a 10-point nerf there. Looks like there might be a bit more decision between them and Rangers before. I felt like the upgrades to Striking Scorpions was probably worth it before that. Now though it might be a little bit more balanced. They're still very threatening though, and 85 points I think is pretty reasonable for them still. And then the Wave Serpent went up from 115 to 125, and that does feel like one of the best ways to get a bunch of their scariest Aspect Warriors into the fight, and what's being used in War Host and Aspect Host with the ability to jump in and out of the transport. The weirdest nerf was perhaps base Dire Avengers going up, and they weren't really considered one of the stronger units, going up to 80 points per 5 rather than 75, and it feels like they more just got lumped in with the rest, maybe due to Azaman being good potentially. Overall, I feel like they are nerfs that affect some of the strongest units that the Aeldari can put on the board, but not really enough to make any of these actually stand out bad. I think all of them are good units and might just have a little bit more internal codex balance. I still feel like the army as an overall is still going to be powerful. Otherwise, for rules changes, Azaman did get nerfed in a big way. His once per game ability still gives you the big damage 3 shuriken shots and anti-infantry and devastating wounds, but now it's only on a 5+, not a 3+. Previously, with a fairly average roll of firepower, maybe a command point reroll, you could have him personally wipe out entire squads worth of Terminators, which felt kind of weird. He does cost a whole load of points though, and now he won't have quite as much individual destructive damage on the time that he activates. I wouldn't be too surprised if the other Phoenix Lords get picked in preference. Otherwise, it was nice to see the Corsairs gain battle focus. I don't know why they had that excluded from their datasheets in the codex, but it seemed like it was an oversight to me. Falcons and Wave Serpents had an FAQ for not being able to carry the Drukhari infantry like Incubi. That seemed like the intention, but it wasn't really quite what they'd written. Armoured Warhost from the Grotmus detachment had a small clarification to one stratagem. Technically there was a broken one that meant that they couldn't fall back and shoot for a stratagem that obviously intended it to be that way, and now that works. It's still probably one of the weakest Aeldari detachments out of them though. It looks like they actually updated a bunch of the Legends keywords for some relevant units, giving them the Azayani one rather than the previous Aeldari one. Certainly a fair few nerfs here. I'd be kind of surprised if Aeldari fall off too hard though. They've got a lot of good stuff in their book, and in particular it does seem kind of notable that the Devoted of Iniad, which was and is one of their stronger detachments, didn't get any specific attention. If Rain, for example, is still 100 points and she's incredibly good, maybe there'll be a slight shift to a few more people playing that, and maybe a few more Wraith Lords on the table, given that there were another strong unit not affected. Despite some nerfs though, I still feel like the Space Elves are going to be in a pretty good position. For the Drukhari, they didn't have too much changed. After the December update, they've still felt kind of middling. They had a few points nerfs, but then also gained the Reaper's Wager detachment for their sort of allied with Harlequins one, and it seems that the Reaper's Wager has still kept them as a fairly competitive faction, more sort of middling win rates as opposed to being weak. That detachment's still very viable, even if you take very minimal Harlequin units, and a few of the datasheet improvements from Codex Aeldari maybe make the Harlequin units a little bit more tempting if you do choose to take them. The buffs that they got here were a decrease on Witches down to 80 points, really quite cheap for a big OC2 unit that you could use just to flip an objective and be fairly expendable now, and I guess they're even more efficient if you're running them for damage with Lilith Hesperax. And Cabalite Warriors dropped from 110 to 100, they were a fair staple in a bunch of lists, sticky objectives and transports being quite nice, plus a little bit of Dark Light Fire. They'll still be awaiting their codex, no word from Games Workshop when that might happen yet though. For most leagues of Votann armies, it's near enough no changes. They have just had a bit of a technical rules rewrite with their rebalancing of their detachment rule and their army rule. They've now got it so basically half of the early Judgment Marks units are from the army rule and half of them are from the Oathband detachment rule. So you get to mark 2 units with the army rule, the Eye of the Ancestors, and then you get bonus rules as per the Oathband. It still amounts to 4 units at a standard Strike Force game, but effectively this works out as a buff to the Halfband currently, the sort of Einhir Hearthguard focused detachment, as now that means that you get a couple of Judgment Marks units right from the start of the game, and maybe that could be at least a small draw to have a few people try that one out again. It was considered one of the very weakest and less exciting Grotmus detachments though, so I don't know if that will be enough to overcome people's aversion there. Otherwise no points changes. Again, they're waiting for their codex, and it seems likely to be later in the edition, and hopefully with another wave of miniature releases. For the Tau Empire, from their points and balance dataslate sort of front, they didn't have all that much, but did gain a fun new detachment. For the points changes, it was the Kroot that were the beneficiaries here. Krootox Rampagers dropped all the way down to just 85 points per 3 of them, and now at this kind of cost they feel like a unit that's kind of hard to go too far wrong with. They can scout and then just bring a whole load of chunky stats to the table, both on the damage and the defense. And it can be extra nice with certain combos in the Hunting Pack and the Auxiliary Cadre. Feels like Games Workshop want to sell a few more of those kits maybe. Otherwise, the Lone Spear dropped down to 80 points. Between his rules, he's really quite a cheap, fast and fairly resilient lone operative as it goes. He might be of a bit more interest to even standard Tau armies that just want something to hang around in the backfield, though I guess he is competing against things like Shadow Sun and the Ghost Kill for that role, but certainly looking pretty standout in the Hunting Pack and the Auxiliary Cadre. Maybe the biggest excitement for the Tau though was a fun new detachment, this one called an Experimental Prototype Cadre. It looks like the theme of this one is a sort of weapons development one, with the Tau being kind of famous for putting their new prototype weapon systems out to field tests, particularly with certain commanders getting special issue war gear. It's quite nice to see the options of the Tau expand a little bit. Their codex did feel a little bit on the thin side with just the 4 detachments in the main book, particularly compared with things like say Orks or Chaos Marines, and very weird that Tau get fewer detachments than say Emperor's Children recently. Again, I'll cover this one properly in a follow-up video. The core rule though is superior craftsmanship with an extra 6-inch to the range of weapons of the Tau Empire, which could be nice for close range things like say the Breachers or maybe Fusion Blasters. The enhancements are quite fun, all amping up various different Crisis Suit weapons, such as Fusion Blades being a Fusion Blaster with 2 attacks at Strength 12 and Melter 4. Maybe a bit of a shame that they don't get a melee profile, but that's still a very, very scary melter weapon indeed. They've got some nice enhancements, a few of which amp up shooting in various different ways. They've got a stratagem for both sustained and lethal hits if you gain hazardous, and that could be a recipe for one squad shooting incredibly hard. Really cool to get some more interesting and flavourful options. For the Necrons, they more or less left them as they were. At the moment, it's the Starshatter Arsenal that seems to be having the best performance, though quite a lot of people playing different detachments, maybe the Awakened Dynasty and the Hypercrypts being most notable after that. The one change that the Necrons did get though was that the Doomsday Arc increased to 200 points from 190. Really not a massive surprise in this one. It did feel like a bit of a weird change when they dropped it from 200 down to 190 before. When they did that, they were already being spammed in Hypercrypt lists. Still looks like a good unit at that points cost, and I guess it perhaps affects the strongest attachment in the Starshatter a bit more than the others, and with Necrons doing well at the moment, it feels like a pretty reasonable change. Overall, nothing insurmountable. Still seems that Necrons will be a good army going forward. For the Orks, it feels like Games Workshop has given and taken away a bit. They've got a fun and fairly scary looking shooting detachment, though have had some nerfs to their meta units and the Tactical Brigade. The Tactical Brigade in particular was being one of the stronger detachments in Warhammer 40k, a really high win rate, with Orky orders doing the business. The nerf to the Tactical Brigade is that now you can only have one Orky tactic issued to each unit. Previously you could double up at the chance of taking a few mortal wounds. Now it's only one order each, so you can't say have the +1 strength and the reroll charges or the stealth coupled with the +1 to hit. And even if you do the one order now, there's still a chance of taking a mortal wound. You have to take a leadership test, and if failed, then you take a mortal wound, presumably with the bosses restoring a bit of order. You still get the tactic even if it fails though. It's definitely a nerf to the overall strength of the detachment, and the units that got points increases also feel like they're ones that more benefited from this than elsewhere. Tank Busters went up to 135 points. Weirdly, they got the specific nerf of bomb squigs must attack the visible target, even if I think that's not the same rule for things like the Squig Hog Boys bomb squigs. The Shock Attack Gun Mech went up to 75 points from 65. That's not great news for Dread Mob either. And the Mech Captain enhancement, the one that gives you the massively dangerous 4 rerolls to hit for flash gits, that one went up to 45 points from 30, though to be honest still well worth it at that points cost. I'm sure that will still get taken. Feels like Tank Busters might be feeling a bit more underwhelming outside of more dedicated shooting detachments now, and Tactical Brigade in general is going to be a bit less standout. Still seems like it's got enough strength to have draw, and I'm sure we'll still get people playing it though. If you want to shoot stuff good though, it looks like the Orks have a brand new detachment called the Mordaka detachment, and this is one that felt like it was missing ever since the Codex came out. They had ones to represent the vast majority of clans, but as well as the Blood Axe one that was missing, which has now been fixed with the Tactical Brigade, the other one that didn't really seem to have good representation was Bad Moons, maybe more standard Orky infantry shooting. Perhaps things to help flash gits and shooter boys. The detachment rule for this one just seems spectacularly powerful. In your shooting phase, Ork infantry and Walker units just casually get sustained hits 2 on their shooting attacks, which is a pretty ridiculous damage output increase. It maths out with the 2 extra hits as basically double damage if you had standard Orky profiles that were hitting on a 5+ before, though I guess it does drop off a little bit if you already had sustained hits from another source. It's not quite as overwhelming if you were hitting on a better number than 5. Still though, that's a monstrously powerful detachment rule, and while the War is active, Ork infantry and Walkers also have the assault keyword on their weapons, so they can surge forward, shoot and charge at the same time. I feel like just with that detachment rule alone, there's probably enough there to already make Orks shoot seriously hard, give that detachment a lot of draw, with maybe things like Looters or Tank Busters, despite the increased costs, still having massive amounts of firepower, and perhaps already seems kind of likely that it could be one of the stronger detachments. Otherwise, they've got some other shooting support things, gaining AP if you target the closest thing, or stripping cover from units. There's also a better melee one as well, as Orks are still Orks. Again, I'll look forward to covering that one more properly in a dedicated video to the 4 new detachments. That just leaves us with the Force of the Hive Mind then. For the Tyranids, they had nerfs to 2 of their most auto-include shooting bugs. The Exocrine goes up to 140 from 135, a small points nerf that'll still say good really. These were being taken in the vast majority of Tyranid lists, and I'm sure they'll still be plenty viable beyond that. The Tyrannifex again was taken in a lot of armies. This one's gone up to 200 points from 190, so a small 5%-ish nerf there. Again, nothing that's going to make it unplayable, but given that those are 2 very powerful units that were included quite a lot in detachments, and particularly in Crusher Stampede, it probably means a small overall power nerf to Tyranids. They did have some positives along with the negatives though. The Neurolictor went down to 80 points from 90. I think it's a lot more feels good there, and it was still being taken in at least decent numbers at 90 points, particularly in Vanguard lists, so I'm sure we'll see it even more with its big +1 to wound things and battle shock shenanigans. The Trigon drops to 140 from 150. Some people still liked it at 150, so a nice move there. And the Hive Tyrant dropped down to 225. This was already included in a bunch of detachments, so I guess if you had a battery of Exocrines plus a Hive Tyrant for lethal hits with them, the whole points cost on that particular formation hasn't really changed much. I guess that's only 5 points if you took 3 Exocrines. Overall, nothing crazy on the changes there. Slightly nerfing some of the most auto-includes, and helpful buffs on a few units that were already seeing play anyway. Finally, for the Genestealer Cults, they just had the 1 small points change, unfortunately not a positive one, and this one saw Neophyte Hybrids jump to 145 points from 130. Not the most feels good change, given that that's one of the best places to put their synergies with enhancements. Having them turn up from Deep Strike with maybe Biophages or a Primus attached and unleashing some big shooting combos still feels like even with that tax, they're still going to be good if you've got an enhancement to help them out plus the character, but I guess there'll be less emphasis on them and more on everything else. Genestealer Cults seem to be fairly well balanced on the tournament stats at the moment. It's interesting to see a few of them making some good use of the final day with the Allied Tyranids one. Overall, a whole load of things to process there. I feel like it's a medium-sized update for Warhammer 40k in general. A lot of armies didn't really have all that many seismic changes, maybe a few things nudged one way or the other, though for certain factions like Chaos Demons things were rather turned upside down with a massive amount of new content. might be an interesting time for collecting them. Overall, it does look like they've managed to hit some of the biggest staples out there in the meta in their various different ways. Things like Solar Spearhead, Bridgehead Strike, Legion of Excess, Tactical Brigade, Ironstorm Ultramarines, and potentially Upsurgent Aeldari lists getting nerfed. Some help for the Sisters of Battle, though maybe not as much as I'd quite have liked, and perhaps not a massive amount for the other things on the sort of lower win rate spectrum of Warhammer 40k. I feel like Black Templars could have maybe used something, and maybe Tau could have used a little bit more of a look at, as opposed to just a couple of crew units. Even if they had new detachment, it's kind of fun. Otherwise, the vast majority of the balance changes and small internal nudges seem reasonable enough. Most things toned down, not to the point of being broken. There may be some of the things they might have gone a bit too far. Perhaps the biggest flavour win feels like the introduction of new detachments. Interesting that we're going to be getting more of them every 3 months until the end of 10th edition presumably, and at first glance the rules seem kind of fun and pretty powerful for each of them, though I guess it's early days at the moment. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below though. How would you rate Games Workshop's changes to your given faction, and do you think that they've done well or badly? As mentioned, I'll try and make the next video the one going through the new detachments in a bit more detail. That's going to be a big one with 4 new ones to talk about, so stay tuned for that. Finally, I'll just return to talk about the video sponsor one more time for those interested. As mentioned, that's Titans Terrain with their pop-up system of folding cardboard terrain for basically a Warhammer 40k battlefield that can fold flat and fit in a box. As mentioned earlier, I'd rate the biggest advantages of this being really quite easy to store and transport due to its folding system, being far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, and at least somewhat comparable with things like MDF or some of the cheapest plastic alternatives. And it's ready to go straight away, so you don't need painting or assembly, and not everyone has massive amount of spare time for creating an entire table that looks great. For the downsides and common criticisms, it is a bit less sturdy and hard wearing than plastic or MDF, given that it's made of cardboard. That's a turn off to some folks, and being designed to fold flat does mean that there's some trade-offs with that, like it not always being very possible to put miniatures in the upper floors of ruins and things due to the lack of support there. The grid layout can also be a bit less flexible than some. You can get some variation by rotating the tiles, though it can create some firing lanes. I'd probably use just a tiny bit of extra terrain to break them up if you want to make it a little bit more functional for 10th edition 40k. Obviously it doesn't really make tournament approved layouts, so if you're looking for that then it'd be better to go elsewhere. It can make some terrain for some good casual games. For the sets that they have, they've got a Forgotten Furnace one, which is all very glowing chaos runes and bombed out refineries and factories. There's a more standard ruined city style one called Shattered Hive, collapsed buildings and armoured containers. And then a more verdant ruin set called an Overgrown Capital. This one could be more appropriate for either futuristic settings or maybe more fantasy ones. Finally, each of those also have an expansion option, basically a big combo 2-tile thing where you push them together to make one greater structure. There's a cathedral type thing for 2 of them, and then a Great Infernal Spire for the factory one. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. Feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to give a look over what they've got. In any case, I'll be back for the next one hopefully in the not too distant future. Looking forward to talking through some army detachments. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and feel free to point out anything that I might have missed. I'll try and update a pin correction comment if there's anything major. If you'd like to support the channel, then check out the Patreon page or the affiliate discount links for buying Warhammer down in the video description. A massive thank you to you guys who are supporting there. But in any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.